Welcome to Stream 1 on Thursday of the NRM in the Rangelands Shaping Our Future conference. Our next speaker is Peter O'Regan. He is normally based in Charters Towers but joins us live at the hub here in Longreach. He's been working with the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries. He moved to Queensland from South Africa, and as soon as he arrived in our great state, he set up one of Australia's longest running grazing trials at Wombiana, and he's here today to talk to us about that trial. Welcome, Peter O'Regan.
Good morning, everyone. Wombiana is, of course, only second longest to Kidman Springs trial, but of course the scenery is much better. As we all know, rainfall in Australia is incredibly variable, with this huge variation from year to year. As a result, it's relatively easy to slide from years such as that in the top left with lots of rainfall and good conditions to just almost being on the edge where there's late dry season, one's hoping for rain, and the next thing people can be in a full-blown drought. Now, the rainfall variability, of course, isn't new to our environment, and there are a number of recommendations that have been derived both from graziers and from government research about managing for this variability. And they're things such as stocking to long-term carrying capacity or adjusting your numbers with rainfall or wet season spelling. But I think it's pretty safe to say that driving around, there hasn't been a total adoption of these strategies. The reasons for this are very complex, as they are with all human behaviour. But one key issue that we identified was a belief that the more sustainable strategies were simply unprofitable. And it was hard to counter that belief given the lack of information that was around at that time. In 1997, John Bushell and myself managed to get funding out of a drought regional initiative to set up the Wombiana grazing trial, which is just south of Charters Towers. The trial had two main objectives, and the key one was to test different grazing strategies in a scientific and objective manner, just to get some hard data on how different strategies coped with variable rainfall in terms of profitability and the impact on the environment. We chose 5 grazing strategies, and there's more detail on these strategies in our paper. Basically, these were heavy stocking, where the thought was you needed more cattle to make more money, moderate stocking at the long-term carrying capacity of the site, rotational spelling, which was moderate stocking with wet season spelling, and then we had 2 variable stocking strategies. The first involved adjusting animal numbers based on a forage budget in May, and the second involved a combination of using a forage budget and looking at the seasonal forecast and then adjusting numbers in November. In 2011, after a technical review of the trial, 2 of those strategies were changed. So both the variable and the SOR variable were then renamed the flexible stocking, and the one treatment then became flexible stocking with spelling, with 6 sub-paddocks involved in that spelling, and then flexible stocking with no spelling. Because the trial is replicated, in both cases, 1 paddock from the variable and 1 paddock from the SOR went to either the flexible with stocking or the flexible stocking with no spelling. In laying out the trial from discussions with our co-workers, it was obvious that we needed to go for a largish paddock, so we managed to get 100-hectare paddocks, and also to have a mix of soil types so that animals were basically simulating what was happening in commercial paddocks, where it wasn't a nice uniform paddock, but animals were moving between different soil types. So in our experiment, there's a similar proportions of the box and the heavy clay and silverleaf ironbark between the different treatments. A key thing for the trial was to have it relevant to the industry. So in ways we manage the treatments or the strategies more as philosophies rather than absolute strategies. And there have been many cases where we've had to ask ourselves, well, in this situation, what would a moderate stocker do or what would a heavy stocker do? And in this area, we've been lucky to have a Grazing Advisory Committee that's been working with us since literally before the trial started in 1997. So if we look what happened at the trial, over the course of the trial, the rainfall's been incredibly variable. So we've had 2 very wet phases starting at the beginning of the trial and then around 2011, 2012, and then 2 marked phases of drought. So the first one was in the early 2000s, and the second, more recent one was particularly severe with 2014-15 being the 4th driest year in the 112 record. So it has been a really good test bed to compare these different strategies. So what happened? If we look at the heavy stocking rate trial, initially you can see in the top left-hand corner, things went pretty well, but within a few years we hit that first drought and we had animals being hay-fed and pulled out of their paddocks because there was probably less than 5 kilograms of grass per hectare in each of those paddocks. Then, of course, a reversion to some of the good years and things were looking good. And then the second drought year, second series of droughts, you can see these animals here being fed, and if they hadn't been fed, they would have literally perished. So if I can show that in a graph in terms of the stocking rate, and here the stocking rate is in terms of animal equivalents per 100 hectares or per square kilometre, you can see the heavy stocking rate, the red line. Stocking rates are relatively high for about the first 7 or 8 years, and then dropping drastically as we had to cut them due to the drought, picking up again in that wet phase, and then a major crash going to the second drought. One interesting thing was that we found that we had to respond to that second drought in terms of management a lot quicker than in the first drought, so simply a loss of resilience. The moderate stocking rate proceeded very well, at least for the first 15 years. And on the top right, you can see animals in November 2014, and that was just at the beginning of the drought. And at the same time, those their comrades in the heavy stocking rate were just about to go into drought feeding. By November 2015, of course, things were getting very short. And in fact, in December 2017, we had to pull all the animals out of the heavy and the moderate stocking rate paddock, not because they basically ran out of feed, because we felt that was what a moderate stocker would do because there was so little grass in those paddocks. So you can see there the stocking rates of the moderate stocking rate compared to the heavy. Then looking at the 2 variable strategies, early in the piece with the experiment, there was lots of grass. We did our forage budgets and we loaded the stocking rates up probably even higher than the heavy stocking rate. Of course, we ran into that first dry spell and we ran into trouble pretty quickly. We got a bloody nose and we realized very quickly that we had to set upper limits to any stocking rates that we ever set, and we had to respond a lot faster, which we duly did. And you can see here in July 2006, the numbers were well reduced by then. Animals were in good shape and lots of grass. And that's been the situation basically since then. And here is the graph just showing the stocking rates. And you can see that very high levels early in the piece. And then right later in these years, you can see the stocking rates have been lower than the moderate stocking rate. Just looking at pasture condition, the main summary points is that heavy stocking has resulted in a major decline in the perennial grasses and in carrying capacity. In the variable flexible strategy, that heavy stocking pre-drought early in the piece in 2001 caused some long-lasting damage that was still evident about 15 years later, despite cut in stocking rates, and moderate stocking largely maintained pasture condition. So going through some of the photo sites pretty quickly, you can see the heavy stocking rate up on the left, and you might also notice one of my colleagues on a motorbike in the center. By April 2006, things are looking pretty grim, but there's still a residue of good tussock grasses in the moderate stocking rate. And then 2010, a bit of a recovery. And then by last year, you can see the heavy stocking rate is in very poor condition. and the moderate stocking rate has lost a fair number of tussock grasses. What you'll also notice, and which I'm not going to discuss today, is the large increase in currant bush that's occurred in the treatments. So the moderate stocking rate at long-term carrying capacity largely maintained pasture condition at least until the 2014-15 drought. But our experience is that reducing stocking rates in drought is absolutely essential to prevent overgrazing, and that's just what Angus White said 2 days ago. And work from my colleague Paul Jones shows that wet season spelling is also very important, and it will accelerate drought recovery. Looking at the animal production, firstly, the individual live weight gain, averaged over the 24 years, individual live weight gain has clearly been lower under the heavy stocking rate. That's also resulted in lower meatworks prices, a lower price per kilogram. Conversely, if we look at the live weight gain per hectare, there has been a greater gain per hectare under the heavy stocking rate on average and lower on the other treatments. But that has only been sustained with drought feeding. And so the heavy stocking rate has needed to be supplemented with drought feeding in 7 out of the 24 years, compared to only 1 year for the other treatments. And that, of course, is a significant cost. So then going on to the gross margins per hectare, and here we calculate the gross margins based on the value of the meat produced, less the costs, and the cost of that cost of feeding, and also the interest rate on the livestock. So here it's very obvious that the gross margin in the heavy stocking rate is only half that in the other strategies. If we then go on and accumulate that gross margin from the start of the trial onwards, just simply adding from year to year, you can see that after 24 years, the heavy stocking rate is very, very far behind and will never catch up to those other strategies. One key point to mention here is that in 2001, when we hit the drought, the heavy stocking rate went from doing very, very well to a consistent loss over the next few years. But in contrast, the 2 variable strategies, they initially had a loss, but that rapid adjustment of stocking rates meant that they ended up making a net profit over the length of the trial. So in summary, the heavy stocking rate was the least profitable. It caused degradation to the pasture, and there was a loss of resilience in that we needed to respond to drought a lot quicker in later years. Moderate stocking rates were far more profitable. They maintained pasture condition initially, but they inevitably led to overgrazing in droughts. Variable or flexible stocking rates were also profitable, but early destocking is essential. And in our later phases of it, we were looking at adjusting stocking rates up to 4 times through the year, and you definitely need limits on stocking rates to avoid degradation. And wet season spelling is, of course, also important. So our key recommendation would be flexible stocking rates based around long-term carrying capacity, but not sticking to them religiously, applying these stocking rates in a risk-averse manner, that is, sharp cuts in stocking rates when conditions start declining and slow increases, regular wet season spelling, and in our environment, which is a savanna woodland, the appropriate use of fire to maintain the tree-grass balance. And then quickly flicking through, finally, I'd like to thank Meat and Livestock Australia and the government and the Lions family of Warnbiana Station for their support. And a quick plug, our funding with MLA runs out in May next year. And if you'd like this trial to continue, please write a check and send it to me personally. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that presentation. The next person we're having come in with us into this stream is Paul Jones. Paul is based with the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries in Emerald, although he has worked in other parts of the state, including in Charleville at the former pastoral laboratory. He's made a career studying pastures and grazing management for at least the last decade, and so he's come to come to share with us some of his experience and observations. Welcome, Paul Jones.
Thank you for the introduction. Yeah, Paul Jones. Going to report on some research we've been doing on spelling strategies for recovery of poor land condition across Northern Australia. The aim of this work is to better understand the different spelling regimes, the impact of timing of spelling, the duration of spelling, frequency, and come up with some better recommendations. So we're looking at the plant level, we're doing some charting, following some life cycles through under different spelling regimes. Now the issue we're dealing with is fairly well depicted in that slide on the left in central Queensland. It's fairly indicative of poor land condition, often on hard setting soils, low fertile soils, duplex soils, and there's a pretty reduction in the density of palatable and perennial grasses. They're typically desert bluegrass, Porphyria wardiana, and an increase in bare areas and also shorter lived perennials, wiregrasses and panics and annuals. Has a significant impact on productivity across Northern Australia. And also the sustainability as well. What we class as sea land condition is possible to recover that because there is still some perennial grasses left there, particularly our 3P grasses there. So there is potential to recover it, and also through wet season spelling and grazing management because of the low fertility, the hard setting of these soils, the fragility of them. Often mechanical treatments, improved pastures are economically not viable or practical on a lot of these soils. So it's a big issue across Northern Australia, and that slide there is pretty typical of sea land condition. We're doing this research at two sites in central Queensland. The first site is Site 1 just outside Claremont, and Site 2 is near Charters Towers within the Wombiana Grazing Trial. Both these sites are about 620 millimetres average annual rainfall. The summer dominant subtropical growing season and very reliant on the perennial grasses to be sustainable and profitable. Site 1. The design of that trial is basically comparing spelling with continuous grazing. These plots are within a continuously grazed paddocks, and we fence off those small plots to implement the spelling treatments. We're looking at early wet season spell, which is the first 8 weeks of summer, typically starting from the break of season. We've had 50 mils of rain over 2 or 3 days, and the full wet season being from that start date for the next 5 or 6 months for the whole summer. Both of those, both the early wet and the full wet, are done on an annual and a biannual basis every second year. And the full wet season spelling treatments at Site 1 were also done on a series of individual years to have a look at the impacts of seasonal conditions. This is some of the rainfall conditions throughout the period of the trial. This is the trial period here at Site 1 from 2010 to 2016. This is a drought index, or the ratio for each month of the previous 12 months rainfall as a ratio of the long-term average rainfall. So the zero line is average rainfall, and if it gets up to 1, we've had double their annual rainfall in that 12-month period. So we had a couple of really good years to start the trial, but then from 2012, middle of it onwards, it was pretty severe drought. This trial was run at a moderate stocking rate, or pretty close to long-term carrying capacity, fairly conservative, and numbers adjusted with seasonal conditions as well. Some of the results, one of the key parameters we measure is what we call basal cover, or the area of living material of perennial grasses at ground level. It's a very good measure of the health and vigour of the pasture and size of the root system. Obviously, the bigger that is, the better the land condition, the more vigorous and productive our perennial grasses. So this is total basal cover. It's basal cover of all the perennial grasses, and I've just put up the 3 treatments here where there has been some significant differences. The crosses are the continuously grazed, the circles are the early wet season annual spell, and the triangles the full wet season annual spell. As you can see at these 2 recording dates, there was a significant difference, albeit small, with the full wet season annual spelling and the grazed treatments. That significant difference was not sustained through the dry years. I guess there's a trend there that the spelling treatments are slightly better ground cover, but nothing to slightly better basal cover, but nothing to improve land condition and productivity as yet. There's some encouraging results there, but the dry conditions have been the overriding result, overriding driving factor there. This is a design for Site 2, so there's actually 2 trials there. One's, again, starting with sea land condition, one trial under a moderate stocking rate, and the other trial sea land condition under the high stocking rate. Again, compared with continuously grazed as much as they can be. Again, the full wet season and the early wet season annual spelling, as well as those treatments done on a biennial basis. Some of the results from that. This is this is the rainfall conditions for that trial again, and the drought index, and this is where the trial has run. Some good conditions leading up to the trial, some high pasture yields, and a good year for the first year of the trial, and then it's been a very severe drought since then, especially this 2014 to 16 period when we had a lot of deaths of perennial grasses. So some 9 out of 10 years of the drought has been of the trial has been pretty severe, well below average rainfall conditions. The moderate stocking rate trial, this is the basal cover of the perennial grasses. As you can see, the dry conditions have reduced that perennial basal cover. There has been a small impact of full wet season spelling, a significant difference in that year, but again, nothing to write home about. There appears to be a trend there, but not a significant difference and not sustained throughout those dry conditions. So the seasonal conditions have been the overriding factor driving basal cover here in the moderate stocking rate trial. The high stocking rate trial, the seasonal conditions have been more severe on the impact of the seasonal conditions has been a lot more severe in driving that basal cover down. While there has been some significant differences with full wet season annual spelling in 3 of those recording dates, again they weren't sustained, and the recovery hasn't. The drop off in basal cover happened earlier, it happened more, and the recovery hasn't great. To show that this graph here is an average across the treatments. So one line for the moderate stocking rate, and one for the high stocking rate. And as you can see, the drought conditions as it started to reduce basal cover. It was pretty much 18 months earlier for the high stocking rate to get down to these low levels that the moderate stocking rate got to. Recovery has been quicker and is happening under the moderate stocking rate. It's probably not going to happen under the high stocking rate because the desert bluegrass is pretty much gone from it. The desert bluegrass, Bophriclara wardiana, is one of our key perennial grasses, and it holds the system together, and it's one of the keys we're looking for to drive recovery. Here's some data on the desert bluegrass under the moderate stocking rate and the high stocking rate trials again average across treatment. So when we set up the trial in 2011, those initial plants, there was only 42% of them surviving under the moderate stocking rate, whereas only 7% surviving under the high stocking rate. So it's pretty much all gone there. Similar levels for survival of the recruits. Basically, none of those desert bluegrass recruits surviving under high stocking rate. You can wind this, do some of these calculations backwards to look at the average time for original plants to die of that 2011 population. It comes up with 16 years for the moderate stocking rate and 10 years for the high stocking rate. Now, these figures have been calculated before, various authors in central Queensland, usually come up with 25 to 30 years for desert bluegrass. You can just see how the run of dry years has hurried that up, and particularly under the high stocking rate as well. But the desert blue actually, under the moderate stocking rate, has maintained its basal area because the bigger plants have survived and maintained basal cover. It hasn't done it under the high stocking rate. It's been mainly the smaller plants that have died, and we haven't had a lot of seedlings, and not many of them have survived. It hasn't been a high survival rate of them either. So some of the key messages coming out of this, desert blues are a long-lived grass. Recruitment rates are not high. They're episodic. You've really got to look after what you've got. Heavy stocking amplifies the drought effects, increase the mortality of those, not just desert blue, but the other 3 feed grasses as well. We're looking forward to getting some good seasons and some recovery, but it's not going to happen under a high stocking rate, and it's going to take a while under a moderate stocking rate. And that land condition improvement we're looking for is going to take time, and you've got to have the right stocking rate and management of that stocking rates as well for that to happen and to support plant vigor. So it's got to be an adaptive management of stocking rates. You've got to know what your long-term carrying capacity is and manage adaptively around that as well. So with those very poor seasons, the numbers need to be lightened off, and with good seasons brought back in a risk-averse manner as well. All right, thank you. I'll conclude there.
Our next speaker is very well known in grazing circles and in natural resource management circles. Terry McClosker is the director and owner of RCS, and he's also the executive chairman of Carbon Link Limited. RCS is an agricultural-based consulting, training and skill development RTO, which has worked in all states in Australia and also in South Africa. Their premier training product is Grazing for Profit, which has over 5,000 graduates in Australia. Today, Terry McClosker will be talking us through some of the changes he's witnessed in grazing systems over the last 30 years. Welcome to the stage, Terry McClosker.
Thank you, Nicole. I first started looking at grazing management well over 30 years ago, and what confused me was all the terminology. So I had to develop a system to interpret what was in the literature and what was happening in paddocks. And so I developed this system here where we looked at, I've got 5 major groups of grazing systems, from continuous rotational resting through to rotational grazing, multi-camp rotational grazing, and the time control methods. And I based the nomenclature on the plant's requirements. So when you're looking at grazing management, are you looking at it from the animal's perspective or the plant's perspective or the paddock's perspective? And so this array of terminology, and it keeps getting added to. So we've got adapted multi-paddock grazing systems has just been added there as well. So I use this system to determine what I'm reading in the literature and what I'm seeing in the paddocks. But the main thing I want to talk about today is a project called Project Pioneer, which we've run over the last few years. The project covered 1.3 million hectares in the reef catchments in Queensland. So it started in the Cape and went right down to the Burnett Mary Cape. There was initially 50 properties and graziers involved in that project, and it eventually developed up to around 150. The capital expenditure over the last few years exceeded 22.98 million from the producers involved in that project. That's more than 7 times the amount of money that was put into an education and support program for producers. Across the board, over a 4-year period, carrying capacity increased by 14%. Animal production increased by almost 14%. And in some areas where we're able to manage land condition very, very closely, over 29,000 hectares, we improved land condition score by 1 unit within 2 years. And some of those years were actually drought years. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the outcomes from this project because it provided quite a large data set. One of the things we looked at was the relationship between ground cover and water quality. So we've got 3 sites here in central Queensland, and TCG refers to time control grazing systems. The controls were continuously grazed. And you'll notice 2019 was a very bad drought year. And you'll see some really big differences between the ground cover on the time control grazing properties versus the controls. And these were basically just through the fence. In 2020, it rained. On the poorer properties, the ground cover obviously picked up when it rained. And that big change in ground cover. In fact, real change in ground cover on the TCG properties. So rain didn't make a difference to ground cover properties, but it made a significant difference to ground cover on the previously grazed properties. We also looked at water quality. So total solids, you'll see massive differences there in the amount of total solids between the time control grazing properties and the control properties. So a huge loss of soil there. Turbidity, also significant differences, quite large differences in turbidity in 2019. Again, the differences were smaller in 2020, And in 2020, these samples were taken right after the first rain. In fact, that was the case in both years. Even so, after that drought year, even the time control grazing properties, total solids and turbidity went up a little bit, but still a difference between them and the neighbouring properties. There was, when we started this project over the 1.3 million hectares, there were properties that had already started subdivision, and there was some data available on the Maya grazing system. And all of these properties grazing introduced to them through this program. So we were able to get a handle on what was happening at scale and with paddocks. Of the landscape that had started subdivision before the project started, that continued. So you'll see that we went on this particular, and this was across quite a few properties, the total paddocks split increased, the average paddock area decreased, etc. The average graze period obviously decreased. And the percentage days not grazed went up to about 86%. And generally, we'd be looking for at least that sort of 80% up to well into the 90% of total days not grazed. And density, which is the driver of change in the landscape, went up from 1 to 6.5. Now, 6.5, that's head per hectare, is right on the bottom limit of densities. Basically, we say that around about 6 to 7 head per hectare, you can start to see some minor effects of density. So we're only just reaching that first threshold. Yield, interestingly enough, across these particular properties where we had prior yield data in stock days per hectare per 100 mils went up %. And again, that's sort of stuff that we would expect over time. When we looked at density, and we had a lot of data on density, I think we had something like 5,000 paddocks worth of data on this. But when you combine it all across a whole range of properties, what you get is absolutely nothing, which makes sense. So we then broke it out onto some individual properties, and you can see that the orange dotted one there, that's a property with higher carrying capacity. You'll see the carrying capacity there was 50 SDHs per 100 mils. And there's a steeper curve in response to density in that situation. When you have a lower stocking rate to begin with, so there's one there at 30 SDHs per 100 mils, you'll see the response to density much slower and lower. And right down the bottom end there's a big chunk of nothing happening, and they're properties with very low densities. And generally, as we say, below around 6 head per hectare, there is no effect of density. One of the other things that we noticed over time, and this was these 2 years here, 1 and 2 were 19 and 20. And again, you'll see that over time, the amount of rest, the recovery days that these properties were providing was increasing. So the blue curves, the blue lines there are properties that were already developed before and started some development before this project started. The orange lines are properties that increased to greater than 20 paddocks on their properties through that time frame, and the grey line was less than 20 paddocks. But even with less than 20 paddocks, and of these guys would have kicked off with 3-4 paddocks, but still using the time control principles, even with low paddock numbers. But the great thing was that as a result of the training and the support, over time, the amount of recovery days was increasing significantly across the project. But what we had here was a massive amount of data. So we had well, thousands and thousands of grazing days of data. I think actually it was more than that, up around 3 million grazing days of data in Maya. We also had economic data and production data across, anywhere up to about 100 properties over 3 to 4 years. And so we thought we're going to find some really, really good relationships out of that. But what we found was the reality. And so I want to use a model that I learned from Professor Stuart Hill. And Stuart says that there is simplicity. And so if we talk about things like just put things in terms of stocking rate or carrying capacity, that is simplicity. What producers are dealing with is complexity. And what we found in the data was complexity. But you cannot deal with the complexity that's actually involved in running a property. Too much going on. And certainly when we started to look at bigger databases, there was just, so period had a significant drought. We had some good rain. We had land prices go up by 20 to 30%. We had cattle prices go up by 30 to 50%. We had people destock during the drought. We had people that didn't have the finance to restock again after the drought, and et cetera, et cetera. And so once you start looking at across that scale, complexity of what's going on within the industry, simple analysis of that data couldn't pull us out a lot of information. So where we need to operate is at the level of profound simplicity. And so this is Stuart's model. He said there's simplicity, complexity, and profound simplicity is the other side of complexity. To do that, we use a series of principles. And these principles have evolved over the last 30 odd years, and they have changed over time. So the first principle of grazing management is plan, monitor, and manage. And I'll come back and talk a little bit more very briefly about that. The second principle is adjusting adjusting rest to suit plant growth. So there's a difference between overgrazing and overstocking. The second principle is to stop overgrazing. The third principle is matching stocking rate to carrying capacity, and that principle is to stop stocking. The fourth principle is managing livestock effectively. Now, this principle is animal production, and it's a massive principle. It covers distance to water, stocking rate match to carrying capacity, quality of water, you name it, and it's in that particular principle. The fourth principle is maximizing stock for minimum time. And this is the horsepower. It's a sexy part of the principle, but it's number 5 for a very, very good reason. It's taken us 30 years to get these principles to settle down and into the right order. And the final principle is managing for biodiversity. And if we look at what those principles actually do, the first principle is about and for people. It is people's decisions that make a difference to land. It's their decisions that make a difference to their business, to their animal production, and to their own lives. So people come first. The next 2 principles for the ecosystem. If you overgraze or you overstock, you will destroy or damage the ecosystem. Some of that can take a very long time to recover, although we've seen that we can recover it much, much faster than we would have thought. The fourth principle is about the business. So when we're looking at animal performance, animal production, we're talking gross margins, and gross margins are one of the key things that affect profitability within a business. The last 2 principles are for the ecosystem and the business itself. They're icing on the cake. So out of these 6 principles, the first 4 are the most critical in terms of making changes over time to the landscape. So I'll pull up there. Thank you.
Hey, Brendan, can you hear me? So because both screens are now parallel and Nicole's busy with the other one, Peter, our host here, facilitator, he's going to introduce himself and the three speakers, and we'll kick straight into it, all right? Okay, we're just going to get them seated. We'll probably be on in about 30 seconds. Sorry, mate. Yeah. Okey-doke. You can come in a little bit more. All right. Yep, I reckon that's good. All right, we're good to go, Brendan.
Good morning. My name is Peter Conradi. I am the facilitator for this panel discussion. I work with the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries in Queensland, based in Rockhampton. I just want to remind you that three excellent presenters here. On my one side is Dr. Peter O'Regan, then we've got Paul Jones, and Dr. Terry McClosker is in via video. I can't see him, but I assume he's here. So we've had three excellent presentations on some of the core issues that are always discussed at Rangelands conferences around grazing land management. And I think there's a lot of questions that have already come in, and most probably there will be more. Between the three presenters, I just made a quick calculation. There's over 110 years of experience in this field. So it's really a good time to ask your questions, and we'll see to how many of these questions we can actually get in some answers. I'll kick right off, and the first question was from Robin Cowley. She said, Peter, is your moderate stocking rate the safe long-term carrying capacity? Do you think declining pasture condition has reduced carrying capacity, and have you adjusted accordingly?
Certainly when we planned the trial, I think we did have the right long-term carrying capacity, or we certainly thought we did, based on modelling and producer advice. Since then, and particularly with the last drought, I believe carrying has declined, and we have adjusted the stocking rates down slightly, but that is something that we need to consider in the next phase of the trial, and hopefully we'll have a technical view and sort that out. Then the next question is from Andrew D. Paul, what do you think are primary reasons for producers not spelling their country?
Oh, I guess I can only speak from the Fitzroy and the Vertican, and there is actually a lot of producers spelling their country, particularly with the great stuff that's happened for NRM groups. I think it's probably a minority that aren't, and a lot of it may just be management as well. Across the rest of Northern Australia, probably infrastructure, but I'm not really, can't really comment on that.
We might move on to Ken Hodgkinson here, who's asked a question to Peter. He said, congratulations on keeping the trial going. He's got a bit of a loaded question here. I assume the treatments have changed plant species richness and species dominance. What is a summary of these changes?
Well, in short, there's been a loss or fairly steep decline in our chief perennial grass, which is Bothria wardiana, or desert bluegrass, and an increase in annuals, and particularly what I would call the weaker perennials, the panicums and the digitarias. There's also herbage production that's become more variable and a lot more flashy, but yes, there has been a decline in the perennial grass, desert bluegrass.
A question here from Andrew Ash.
He said, Paul, given the spilled areas are fairly small plots, do you know if they receive a high amount of grazing pressure once they are opened up?
No, Andrew, that was a real concern. The design of that trial, the high stocking rate, obviously, it's a high stocking rate. With our graze controls, it's very similar. It's something we would observe straight away if it was happening. It hadn't happened. It was a concern at the beginning of the trial that could happen, and also that the spelled plots could massive moribund materials wouldn't be grazed at all, and neither confident there.
The next question is from Leanne. It's a question that all of us are interested to hear the answer to, Peter, and this is for you. Are you optimistic? Just lost it. About practices, findings like this? Have you noticed a shift in the way graziers manage their country over this 24 years? I know producers involved in the whole project. You've got a producer advisory group. So it's an interesting question. And after you've given your response, I would be interested to hear from the other two panel members also what they think.
Well, in terms of our producer advisory committee, some of them on that committee are very good managers, or in some ways we would be learning from them, from their experiences and the long-term management that they've had on their properties. In terms of the wider adoption, I'm really not qualified to say, but from what I hear, the answer is not really, because I think there are part of it is there are a lot of external drivers that also affect what people adopt, and there's a difference between what they would like to adopt and what they can actually implement. A recent meeting we had with our advisory committee and other graziers highlighted a major area of concern, and that was that everybody was saying how there was a lack of response to the improved rainfall in the last few seasons, and that was being widely reported all over the district, and I know in Western Queensland as well. So we have a real concern that there's a slow decline in the carrying capacity of our land, and basically we're all standing on a sandbar, and the sandbar is slowly eroding away from under our feet. And I think it's a cause of major alarm.
Maybe Terry is online. If you can tell us what is your experience in terms of adoption of all the new findings that have come about over the past, I think you were referring to 30 years of some of the data that you referred to. Over time, is the rate of adoption increasing, and what are some of the barriers would you describe?
Thanks. I certainly support Peter's contention that we're standing on a sandbar and it's eroding out from underneath us. I first observed that in the early 80s, and when I increased the stocking rate in country in the territory from a beast to 100 acres to beast to 5 acres. And in 5 years, the desirable perennials had disappeared. And that was alarming to me. So I think, we have a real problem. Is it changing? We were able to get a real lens on this through Project Pioneer, which was funded by the federal government to reduce runoff into the reef. And therefore, the goal was to increase ground cover and reduce runoff. What we found was that in the first, so there was a very solid education program with a big support program. And what we found in the first 1 to 2 years is that the focus was on the business. The focus was on trying to understand profitability. It was also on getting a handle on animal production and was gaining confidence. We found that there was the uptake of grazing management and impact on ground cover started from about the 2nd to 3rd year and accelerated from then on. And it had to do with the hand holding, it had to do with the confidence, it had to do with a lot of peer support and this process was set up so with a lot of peer-to-peer support, and we were actually forced to go to the highest erosion areas, catchments, and work with people who had not done the far and away the vast majority of the landscape had not done anything previously. And yet by the end of 4 years, there was significant change across all of those properties. So sum that up, it was the education component. More than the education, it was the support, and it was the confidence to make the change based on economics. And the fact that they went ahead and spent nearly 23 or over $23 million of the money in those last few years on fencing and water indicates the industry will change if they have the confidence and the knowledge to do it.
Thank you for that. I think that is a big topic for discussion, and I think in recent years a lot more has gone into to try and work out how people think and what creates practice change, and a lot of good work has been done in all the different groups to look more at the human side. Another question here is from Caroline Pettit from Darwin. Peter, you mentioned incorporating fire as part of the management in your paddocks. Do you still use it? Have you done it in Wambeana, and what was the effect?
We burnt the trial twice, in 1999 and 2011, and the trial is really due for another fire. We've noticed a big increase in currant bush, Carrizo ovata, and there's also thickening of brigalow suckers taking place. We won't be burning until we get a reasonable season and until we've got a decent fuel load and we have a good seasonal outlook. But we've definitely got areas where brigalow suckers have increased substantially, and you can see the grass dying out underneath them. So that whole woody weed, well, not woody weed, but the woody component, it's essential to manage that. I didn't show some of the data that we've got from satellite data showing the increase in persistent green cover. And yeah, that is the other big sleeping lion, for want of a better word, in the northern industry, is that slow thickening up of the woody vegetation.
I have a question here from Marie Bowen, and this is to Paul. Will you test whether pasture condition and land condition can improve on a paddock that have been heavily stocked over a good period of time, and when there's been actually been good rainfall years? Examples: remove stock from heavily stocked paddocks to see if they recover similarly to the moderate stock paddocks, given adequate rainfall and spelling.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of data we've got pointing to it won't recover to a good composition of perennial grasses. In a previous project, we actually measured the viable seed bank, both at Site 1 and Site 2 from 2011 to 2016. And there's very low densities in some years, no viable seed bank of the perennial grasses in the paddock. And that's just a function of, desert bluegrass. It's long-lived and doesn't recruit very often by seedlings, and those seedlings have got to survive as well. So there's some real concerns there. Anecdotally, we can. There's a lot of properties that have recovered land condition, and we don't understand those processes, but it's quite likely that seed does come in from adjoining areas, from sort of mosaics in the landscape. So yeah, a bit hopeful, Marie, but I guess the data suggests that it's going to go to a 2P dominant pasture, and golden beard grass is another one that survived there. I think it's a very good perennial grass, and it's one that has growing points well below the ground surface. So it's hanging on there in the high stocking rate because of the location of its growing points. So it could end up being a cornerstone of production in recovering seed condition country.
So maybe leading on from that, there's been a couple of questions about the trial extending it. A question is, how long is long enough for a long-term grazing trial? I'm not sure if there's a clear answer to that, but in terms of the work, Paul, that you've been doing, where you're actually looking at the recovery side also, what would you indicate how long would you need to get a better grip on this? Because you've made some findings, you've come through a really dry spell now. How long do you think would be required to gather some really sufficient data to be able to make a much stronger statement?
Yeah, I guess if I can quote David Orr, he said you need to study plants through 2 life cycles to really understand them. So that would make it nearly 60 or 100 years. No, it'd be great to have a run of good seasons and I think that's going to need to happen with the recovery and follow that through. So yeah, it's 10 to 20 years critical, I think.
Terry, anything that you want to add to that?
I remember a meeting I had up North Queensland at one stage with a group of grazers. We were talking about managing Mitchell grass, and some of those guys have been managing it for 60 years, and there was 100 years of experience there. And amongst those people, they said there was nowhere near enough experience and knowledge to know how to manage Mitchell grass. So I'd agree with David, a couple of lifetimes at least.
Yeah. Can I just comment on that?
Please.
The Wambeana trial's been going, this is our 25th wet season that we're going into. And if you actually go back through different parts of the trial, our actual conclusions that we drew in the first 5 years are pretty different to those after 10 years and quite a bit different from those after 15 years and then after 20 years. So things have changed. And I know funding agencies don't like to hear this, but we're dealing with systems that take a long time. They can change very quickly and they can change very slowly. We're looking at decadal climate cycles and we're looking at plants that can live 20 or 30 years. So we just have to be in there for the long haul, unfortunately.
I see we're running out of time. Is that the case? So thank you very much for participating. Thank you to the panel members. I think it's been an excellent gathering. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter.